Morning and welcome to the Bernkopf Goodman webinar, Retail and Restaurants 2 Years into the Pandemic. We will have a question and answer session after the presentation, so please use the Q&A section to submit your questions, and our speakers will answer as many of those questions as possible at the end. Quick reminder, the purpose of this presentation is for information only. Communication with any member in this forum does not establish a client relationship. Any information provided by our panelists is not legal, tax, or financial advice. Confidential or time-sensitive information should not be discussed on this forum. Today's webinar is being led by Allon. Eric is a partner at Bernkopf Goodman in the real estate and business groups. Eric has been recognized as a thought leader in real estate and has written extensively, as well as been a speaker and moderator on numerous panels. Joining Eric, we have Jesse Baerkahn, founder of Graffito SP, a strategic partner to landlords, tenants, and developers focused on ground floor activation of mixed-use products. Graffito's work spans the project inception to completion and exists at the intersection of retail leasing, neighborhood strategy, urban design, and branding. Nia Grace, the proprietor of the award-winning Darryl's Corner Bar and Kitchen located in the south end of Boston, and the new cafe and event space, the Underground Cafe and Lounge. Nia is also the founder of Boston Music Fest, the Massachusetts Restaurant Association Director, and co-founder of the Boston Black Hospitality Coalition. Jeff Arsenault is a principal at Avison Young, leading the retail practice group in Boston and co-leading the group's global retail platform. He brings insight, creativity, and vision to deal making for both landlords and tenants, with successful conclusions resulting in storefronts across the landscape being filled. Thank you again for joining us. Eric, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you, Jeanette, and thank all of you for attending, and each of the panelists, Jeff, Nia, and Jesse, for joining us today and taking time out of their busy lives. Nia, in a particular, congratulations go to you because you have an upcoming wedding. So that's very exciting. So thank you. We all know that when the pandemic struck, it struck fast. And when the governor's orders came out in March of 2020, it was devastating pretty much instantaneously to many retail and restaurants. But let's get a ground view of what it was like. And let's first start as where we were just before the pandemic. Let's go back to November of 2019. And we're going to start with Nia. Nia, tell us what was happening with Darryl's.
Thanks again, though, for having me here. In terms of what was happening, you know, it was a regular day in the life of Darryl's Corner Bar and Kitchen. So we celebrate, or we serve up Southern comfort food. We have live music. So if it was one of those days, I was kind of bustling through a busy, crowded, dining room. We have a 2,000 square foot space, but we get about 130 people in there comfortably, people who don't mind being shoulder to shoulder to, smell great food, have great music. We were featuring over 50 bands a year, 6 nights a week. We were averaging about $1.9 million in sales. Within my first year, which was, by November of 2019, I was 14 months into new ownership. We had increased catering revenue by 200%, 46 team members, and it was just a lot of new energy.
Oh, that's so exciting. It was, but you had just acquired 14 months before, not long to the end, but a lot of changes and a lot of sense that growth was going to be happening.
Yes, definitely.
Jesse, let's turn to you. What were you seeing then? And you may remember, Jesse, we did a podcast together in November of 2019 about all the exciting things with your clients and placemaking. What was happening from your perspective in November of 2019, and what were you looking at for the future then?
Yeah, it feels like a long time ago. But first of all, thanks for having me, Eric, and Jeanette. Hi, everyone. So, it's interesting when I think back to 2019 at Graffito, we were definitely ramping up for change. And that was triggered by, no doubt, change happening in kind of the retail industry. Certainly not the kind of change we expected, or I should say the pandemic was not the kind of change we were expecting. But ultimately, we were forecasting a time when there was kind of a glut of retail real estate. There's so much development that has been happening leading up to the pandemic in Boston. Municipalities are encouraging developers, as we all know, to add as much ground floor active use as possible in retail space. So in a really short amount of time, call it between 2009 and 2019, the amount of retail real estate we added to Greater Boston, millions of square feet, while tenant requirements, even pre-pandemic, were getting a lot smaller, right? So if you think non-restaurant, drop shipping is here to stay, right? People just need to hold less inventory as they did, back in the 1980s, 90s, early 2000s, obviously much further back. So the premise requirements changed. Omni-channel retail was here. And, Jeff, I'm sure will pick up on this, but for those of us in the retail industry, even pre-pandemic, we were hearing a lot of grumblings about traditional retail being dead. Many of us didn't really believe that, but we're certainly, like I said, positioning ourselves for change. So what that meant at Graffito was we had just brought on 4 new hires that were one focused on urban design, 2 focused on branding and creative services. We got to work with Nia over the past couple of years with that team, and then a retail broker. So it's kind of an interesting time to add 4 people to the team. And there were some positives and negatives to that as it played out over the last couple of years, but that's where we were. That's kind of some of the things that we were certainly thinking about.
So Jeff, you were part of some of the incredible deals that changed the landscape in Boston. One of them being you put the Walgreens Emporium into the old Borders bookstore on School Street. You also put Italy Boston and in the Pru. Quite an amazing accomplishment. But beyond that, you were dealing with small tenants all over the place. And what was your perspective back in November of 2019? I think we even had lunch then, and you were quite optimistic about the future.
Optimistic, ambivalent in a sense that, and by the way, Eric, thanks for inviting me, and hello everybody as well. And great to see you and Jeanette and Jesse and Nia on the panel. So right before the pandemic, across our entire Avison Young platform here, Europe, all over the place, as retail brokers, we were working through what I call sort of the retail evolution that was well underway. The advent of online consumer shopping, the impact on that to bricks and mortar, the omni-channel presence that was very much in place that Jesse touched on with his opening remarks. And then how do we properly advise landlords with respect to that? And then how do we properly advise tenants with what their spatial needs might be? So that was absorbing a lot of thought and brain power for all of our brokers across our platform. And we were in the middle of all of the reckoning, I call it. And then we have COVID hit, which was an accelerator event that we'll probably talk a little bit more about later in the webinar. Right as to answer the original question, we were poised to start to understand what's going to happen to traditional retail for repurposing uses, the Lord and Taylors of the world, the J.C. Penney's of the world. And then we were hit with COVID, and the event was accelerated with traditional retail, traditional restaurants, chain restaurants. So we're coming out of that, and
Jeff, so one of the things that's interesting that we had talked about a bit, and I'm not sure, Nia, and before we go into what happened when the pandemic happened, landlord-tenant relationships had started to change, but not really. Many landlords had perceived of tenants as being arm's length. We deal with you in a traditional pattern, and you pay your rent on time and you comply with the lease. And if you don't, we're going to be chasing you and the guarantor. But that changed quite a bit when the pandemic happened. Nia, let's go back to you at the ground level. So now the governor's orders come out, and help us on the day before and the day after those governor's orders come out that weekend. What were you seeing almost instantaneously?
As soon as the state of emergency was said, and this is, several days before the shutdown on the 17th of March, we already saw our reservations start to fall off. So again, for a very typical Friday and Saturday night where we can start the evening with 150 covers, again, keeping in mind that our restaurant seats 60, so that's about 2.5 turns. That's exciting for us. That's how we looked forward to going into every single weekend. That Friday, I started to see the numbers drop a little bit more. And then, way before 2 a.m., which is when we closed, we had almost no one in the restaurant. Saturday, the same thing happened. And then that Sunday, we have a truly unique Sunday jazz brunch that's all you can eat, and it's always filled, and there's always a line and always a wait. And you could have brought the entire half of my city inside of the restaurant on that day. And to me, having had access and being a part of networks like the Massachusetts Restaurant Association, we were already having that conversation and understanding that the governor was having a special conversation about what we're about to do next. And so it was even at that point, Sunday, I remember sitting in the restaurant empty, only at 2:00. Where our brunch doesn't end until 5. I had made the decision at that point in time when I watched no reservations come in for Sunday evening to close early. And by Monday morning, when we got that notification that by the close of business Tuesday, we would no longer be able to do indoor dining, we had to make a really serious decision, and our team was already working towards that. What I can say specifically and what we did is that we made the decision very much immediately to make that what we call the pivot to takeout only.
Okay, and so that's what happened right then. Jesse, in your business, what was going on? And Jeff, you can jump in at any time, but what started to happen right after the pandemic, and move it a little bit forward for the next year? What happened? Push that dial a little bit forward and let us know what was going on from your perspective, both in retail and in restaurant.
Yeah, I think big picture, and this is probably true for everybody who joined us today. I think there was a lot of pursuit to gather information and learn. I think that was happening on the tenant and the landlord side, but it was a very hard time to do such. Things were moving very fast. Whether that's from a transactional perspective or regulatory perspective or public health perspective, it's a different sort of acceleration that I think Jeff was talking about, and we'll come back to. But the pace of change was such that made things very hard. And for our business, we spent all of our time trying to play catch up. And it was pretty early on, at least for us, not necessarily for all of our partners and clients, we had to stop trying to play catch up and just acknowledge the challenges ahead. And, that some of that remains true through until today, as we're continuing to deal with major issues in labor, things that I know Nia's experiencing and we may end up touching on today. But I think it was this overall feeling for everybody that things were on edge. You were playing catch up with not enough information, and it was all about survival. And I think what emerged out of that and during that for many entrepreneurs was, all right, how do we adjust to this wildly ambiguous environment and continue to try to innovate and change and get better? And I think we're still in that world right now in retail. And, to my earlier point, I think we were almost there a little bit before the pandemic, that people were acknowledging just the rapid acceleration of rate change. And, that only accelerated more through the pandemic. And we're still in that world now. And we're just seeing on both sides, the tenant and the landlord, the constant need to evolve. And I think that's a much harder thing, candidly, for landlords to do, who've been very used to triple net deals. You sign a lease and see you later. That's not the future of retail from a landlord perspective, right? Across so many different silos, whether it has to do with the way in which you try in your own way to tackle anti-racism as it exists and the need for such in retail, or as it exists in adjusting the way you think about security deposits and barriers of entry, or as it exists just in terms of kind of giving tenants the ability to change. So it's come harder for landowners than it has for tenants, but that's the world we're in today. And that's the world we were certainly in for the first, months and year of the pandemic.
Yeah, I'm going to respond after Jeff has a chance to talk about what it was like from a legal perspective. But
It's
Jeff,
so-
you and I had spoken at one time during the early days of the pandemic, and you said to me, it's 10 times the effort that I put in before, and we're doing 1/10 the deals. And so what was it like from your perspective?
Well, it was the first time in 25 years doing this, I finally started paying attention to force majeure clauses and the ineffectiveness of them. So just sort of jumping forward. So you asked, where were we before the pandemic? And then now getting into Q2, Q3, and Q4 in 2020. So what started to emerge for me was some bright spots, and that was the recognition of the symbiotic relationship between landlords and tenants. Probably much like Jesse's crew, we spent a tremendous amount of time pro bono working on behalf of landlords and tenants, and working out forbearance agreements, working out, just putting aside the arm's length sword fights that typically go on between landlords and tenants, and come together collaboratively and understand how we're all going to get through this. The landlords who valued the Chipotles of the world quickly in March or April was served notices that the rent payments are on hold for an indefinite time. I juxtapose that against a Darryl's restaurant that has everything in the world rolled into the success of that restaurant, meaning her ability to pay her bills on a personal level, and how those types of tenants actually shoulder to shoulder worked with the landlords and came up with thoughtful resolutions and worked out the issues. And as Jesse said, what was then still a really uncertain environment. So here we are as brokers, and we're always focused on credit and security deposits and the value of having Starbucks in your developments. And lo and behold, when all of the reasons you want to put these types of retailers in your developments and the rubber hits the road, guess what? They were the first ones to hit the bailout button. And the local tenants were the ones who stepped up and made good faith efforts, open book, and said, here's what's going on. We got to make a go of this. How can we do this together? So in all of the turmoil and all of the tension that has been in place until very recently, one of the bright spots for me was seeing that collaboration between more of the local retail and the landlords, and the recognition of what a great symbiotic relationship that can be. And I think, Nia, you could probably attest to many phone calls with probably your landlords that were heart-to-heart talks, not adversarial talks. So
Yeah,
in our forbearance discussions, we were trying to bring the landlords and the tenants, depending on who we were representing in the transaction, it actually wasn't making a difference. We were coming up with creative solutions to try and keep landlords who were dependent on rent checks to make mortgage payments, and the Darryls of the world that need to keep doors open and need to keep cash flow in place to pay employees. Forget about Nia probably taking a salary. So it was a little bit of a bright spot in the middle of a storm for us. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that affected business practices later in the discussion. But in answering your question, Eric, with respect to what was going on during the pandemic, that was what I was seeing as a sort of a quantum change for me in the way landlords were starting to think about things, on top of the dynamic changes that were already underfoot with retail, and the impact of e-commerce on retail and bricks and mortar.
So a couple of things quickly, and then I'm going to turn to Nia and talk about coalition and working together. But what I was seeing immediately was landlords negotiating with tenants right away on either forbearance or abatement agreements, many abatement agreements in relation to, let's say, childcare. You were just out of business unless you did an abatement. And the landlords I knew were trying to work that out. And I was on tenants and landlord side. And the landlords were by and far reasonable in what they were trying to do and keeping their tenants alive. But in reality, they fell into three buckets. One bucket is those who had pivoted quickly, as Nia said, and they knew they were going to make it, and they had applied for PPP money, and when they got it, they helped to pay rent, and that was big. But there were a lot of people who didn't have access to the money, and those were those small restaurants, small retail, who just didn't have all the backup and legal and accounting to get in quickly. And by the time they tried to get in, they were out of business. So from landlord's point of view, those groups that were not going to make it, generally they took back the keys. And then there was the group that was getting PPP money and paying. And then there was those that, for whatever reason, needed to be carried over until they got the money or for longer. So hundreds and hundreds of workouts in different scenarios. Interestingly, office tenants that were really retail tenants, whether they were in the shoe business or the luggage business or whatever, but their underlying business was retail, they were in just as much trouble, but there wasn't as much accommodation in relation to office tenants who were really retail. As one might expect. But the collaboration, Jeff, you spoke about was right at the core of it. Now, Nia, right then you became, besides trying to keep afloat and trying to make ends meet, Jeff pointed out, you actually, as we discussed privately, you paid your rent, but you also were co-founder of a coalition to keep others afloat. How did that come about? That kind of, we're going to help each other in the community, even though we're competitors in some ways. How'd that initiate to you?
Well, at first, just would focus on the savings and the sacrifice, right? That's how I feel that, my personal business was able to move ahead. As Jeff said, I didn't take a salary, not until most recently. We had to figure out cost savings. And so that was like severely cutting down our menu. Unfortunately, we had to, obviously, like a lot of others, severely cut our staff. We lost 96% of our staff. We had to figure out how to do more with less people. And that was a large reason why I thought we were going to make it and we're going to be able to stay in good standing with our landlord, as well as all of our utilities and everything else. So that was my model. But then when I looked to some of my peers and realized that, again, like most of us, literally March 17th, we were 18 months, or I was 18 months in operation now as a new owner. We talk about the failure rate of restaurants or small business retailers in general, that's under 3 years. And with a restaurant, it's typically 18 months. So here we are, and this happens. I knew that some of my peers who were in it a little bit less than me were going to have those same struggles. And so we just started talking. The thing about the PPP, for which one might say credited, at least round one was credited to saving a lot of businesses, was that it was so confusing, right? There was so much information that you had to figure out, because at the end of the day, it's the Paycheck Protection Program. And it literally says like, this should be going towards a paycheck. Well, when you lose 96% of your staff because you don't even actually have the business to operate, it makes it sound like the PPP was not for you. And you didn't really understand that you can get that and have that be elongated. For smaller businesses who may not even had as much staff as me, if you only had 10 people, your amount of PPP was significantly less. And all that may have done was kind of get you through a month. So for us, it was a matter of having those conversations and figuring out how we can fill in the gap for the information, that wasn't really clear, filling the gap for resources. We talked a lot about within our circle about having a bank that deposited and, cash checks for us, but in fact, they didn't have a relationship, and that was a severe problem. So when it came time for programs like PPP to be released, there were some retailers and business owners who got that heads up, and there were many who did not. And so by the time they got to the table, they didn't have the forms, they didn't have the documents together, they didn't have an opportunity to even apply.
Yeah. And so what's interesting about what you say, and ties into another part of what our discussion is, that government could do better by reaching out into the community, making the process easier, and also facilitating it, particularly for small business owner. And that would be something that on a going forward basis, both at the local and national and state level, they should do. You need to be out in the community. You need to be able to assist people, and you need to work with those who may not necessarily have all the resources that a Shake Shack or others at the larger level immediately have at their fingertips. And I think that's critical when you look to how they form programs and how money is distributed, that it needs to be done on an equitable manner. Jesse, let's go back and touch on a couple of things that we've hit on. Now we're still in the pandemic. You spoke to me just yesterday about the fact that you're still seeing some great suffering out there in retail and restaurants in January and February of just this year. But do you see on looking at that a future in restaurant and retail that's bright in any respect?
I mean, the quick answer is yes. But to your point, just looking at the data, I mean, December and January were terrible. Terrible. And those are months, particularly December, that for retailers are supposed to be your best month of the year, whether you're in soft goods, whether you're in luxury goods, whether you're a restaurant. And because of the most recent surge and variant, so many retailers lost a lot of revenue they really needed. And, that's just, so I think many retailers, and this is important for us all to remember, are still playing catch up. And the catch up is only harder looking forward because costs of goods are up. Labor is really hard to find if you can find it, and it costs a lot more. There are supply chain issues that we've all heard about. These are not just news items. These are real issues facing the small business community, right? So, and margins are way down because of all of it. So we're in an environment where we see spring and summer and moving forward as a true bright spot for retailers that have struggled for 2 years now. But they're entering back into a market where things are harder, period. Pandemic aside, things are going to be harder to do business. And that's something that we're just really well aware of. We are very optimistic. Our whole business is reliant upon sorry, some FaceTime coming in. Our whole business is reliant upon growth in the retail segment. And, we believe it'll be there, but we believe it's going to be really, really hard. And I think that we're having a lot of conversations even today with our clients and partners who are like, we're ready to go. We're out of this. Like, let's get back to where we were a couple of years ago. And our conversation with them, unfortunately, is not so fast. Is like, let's just still remember and let's still think about, as we're putting together deals, how do we be really smart about the obstacles facing tenants? Because at the end of the day, if you can't drive revenue, you can't really pay rent, right? So, hate to paint a dreary picture, but I think this really is just reality.
So what's interesting is, in Boston, an article came out in the Globe recently. 1/7 the office workers back as pre-pandemic. You just don't have them there. 1/3 the foot traffic downtown, except one wouldn't know either of these as one is driving downtown because traffic has been pretty intense. So just as Tip O'Neill said, politics is local, the retail and restaurant business is local too. What's happening downtown may not be necessarily what's happening in the strip mall, but overall the statistics are, as you say. but they're in the face of retail is changing. Jeff, you and I had spoken about MedTel and Nurse in a Box and Doc in a Box, and which was also written up recently, and other things that are filling in the retail space, but not necessarily what we think of as traditional retail. What are your thoughts about what you're seeing in business and the bright lights? And tying into what Jesse said, who are those who are going to be able to survive? What are the lessons that you feel you've seen and learned that say these are survivors? And I would make a footnote. Nia's a survivor. She survived the pandemic, and she is exactly what landlords are looking for. And I'd also mention that Jesse tries to place make. He's trying to not put in chain restaurants or retail in the location. He wants it to create a community that people want to come to and go to. So how are you seeing things, Jeff?
If I had my phone handy, I'd start playing Gloria Gaynor, I Will Survive, because I think that'd be a nice transition in the way you said. I don't have my desk over there. So a couple of different segments of the market we're talking about. So for restaurants, there's no question there's a lot to take out in 2020. I think consumers are returning to dining out. Toast released a report a couple of weeks ago that says on-premise sales are up 70% year over year, Q4 2021. That's no surprise. And 55% full year growth over 2020. And I would imagine Nia might agree with that. You balance that with strong earnings reports about a month ago from DoorDash and Uber Eats. So we're still in this bifurcation of, are we going to have the traditional restaurant model that we're used to going forward? I think the jury's still out on that segment of the market. I think the restaurants that were really smart during COVID, who were utilizing their own apps and not paying the 20 or 30% to DoorDash and Uber Eats and eating up all their margins. I think that was smart. I think we talked about in one of our practice sessions, I think Nia was one of those restaurants that maybe reluctantly used them, but also developed their own tools and techniques for getting food out the front door. I think we're going to continue to see that. I think we're going to continue to see consumers want both dining experiences, and they're going to want to have in-house dining experiences as well. So I think that's going to continue, and the jury's going to be out on where those numbers are going to shake out. With respect to retail, hard, soft goods retail, the typical merchandising that we see that goes on in shopping centers, storefronts downtown, I think it's going to be market by market. I think you go into Seaport on the weekend, and where we may get to a point, believe it or not, hard to see now, but we might get to a point where we're going to be overstored for restaurants again. And then you bump out into the Newtons of the world and those inner urban markets. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of the action. I call it that last mile retail. I think the same holds true for the goods and services that we typically see in mixed retail formats. And where we're starting to see some backfill occur is with medical office tenants and non-traditional retail tenants. They don't really do much for the merchandising mix that you set out to achieve when you contemplated the project. But what they do is they pay rent and they fill up storefronts. And that's going to be, I think, one of the conundrums we're going to be faced with. As retail in and of itself it continues to evolve with omni-channel presence. I think a great example is for instance, like a Bonobos, where they don't have a big back of the house. You go in, you get to showroom, try on your clothes, and then it shows up on your doorstep the next day. So all of the things that we talked about at the beginning of the webinar that we were starting to get our arms around, as we come out of this pandemic, I think are back in play, and some of the acceleration that took place because of COVID is now coming to the forefront. And I would say a year from now, we're going to have a better sense of some of the traditional retail and where that's going to end up. And when we're advising clients, with respect to the landlords, on a go forward basis, we're pointing out that the local tenants were really the tenants that, got stuck through with the landlords through the pandemic. And let's take that and build on that and create great local experiences and not be so afraid of that and not be so willing to cast that aside to go find a Chipotle. And nothing against Chipotle. There may be people on the call that represent Chipotle. I like Chipotle. However, the landlords I represented weren't happy with the form letters they got, and then the drain on the PPP money that Chipotle, went after too. So, going forward, I see, still uncertainty and a little bit of a change of mindset on behalf of landlords accepting, some startups and more local leasing.
Now, Nia, Jeff mentioned Toast and she mentioned Uber Eats. Jeff mentioned Uber Eats, and you and I had talked about that recently about what impact Toast has. Toast is a local hero to many, and they changed their app for you, which made a big difference. Could you talk a little bit about that and what's going on in relation to your income based upon the issue that Jeff touched on?
Yeah. So one, Toast, we've been like a customer of Toast since the beginning. So we had an opportunity to see the different innovations. One of the key things that I appreciate about Toast as a company is that they listen to their customers. It's a software that was built by restaurant people, and they understood that the voice of restaurants really made their app or their application even better. One of the key things that came out of it is that they had already moved into this online platform in terms of ordering. So that piece became really key when we talk about having those third-party vendors like a Uber Eats or a DoorDash or a Grubhub. Toast was already there with the ease. That's one of the things, and I think innovations that really came out of the pandemic is that, as much as a customer enjoys coming in, looking at a menu, pondering it, they also enjoy the instant gratification of getting in and getting out as well. And so the ability to go online, place your orders, have it be fed directly to the restaurant, understanding that now the burden that comes in on the restaurant is having to take that order and place it back into the system so that they can get to the kitchen. They cut out a lot of the middleman. They understood that we didn't have that extra person to do that order taking in the middle anymore, and they made it feed directly into the house. Small changes like that help to increase efficiency as well as productivity. In addition to, just that online ordering platform where we talk about the savings, where we're not actually putting out 30 to 33% of our dollar, before the food even gets out the door to an Uber Eats or a Grubhub. It also realized that restaurants being very sensitive, being very risky in terms of financing and funding and startup, they understood that, listen, if we could give you 1 year of data that shows that this is the health of a restaurant and their sales, and then take that data and allow a financial institution, a traditional one for the most part, like a bank, say, look, this is what they do. This is what you could lend them. This could be very helpful for the industry. Now, banks may have not, jumped on that idea first, but what Toast was able to do, which was very, very critical, is that, well, we've got the data, we can lend to you. So for restaurants who had Toast and did not have a full year's worth of sales when they started the pandemic, but after those 3 months, the first 3 months, now they had a full year of sales. Toast was able to offer financial assistance in the term of a loan that would allow you to borrow and then pay it back in increments based on your sales. And that is a way, to me, innovation really met and kind of answered the need during the pandemic. And I applaud Toast for that.
Interesting. Toast has gone through quite a roller coaster. It fired a ton of employees at the beginning of the pandemic and then came roaring back and publicly traded. Although its stock has taken a recent hit, Jeff pointed out some very bright spots, and I think Toast has an incredible runway and future. And it's wonderful to hear how valuable they were in a variety of ways, both on takeout and in relation to financing. Jesse, I want to come back to you in relation to you're not a traditional hire for a landlord in a variety of ways. You look to not just get tenants, but to make sure the match is right and to create communities. You're credited with creating a lot of what Kendall Square is today, and having worked with MIT, and you're working with Harvard as well, and trying to create other communities, HYM and Suffolk Downs. So the challenge faced with doing that today, more than just the individual restaurants, but how does that neighborhood look, and how do you curate it for different neighborhoods? How do you see that going forward? And I want to leave time at the end to see, do you have any kernels that you've learned that could help people in this difficult, I think extremely difficult, as Jesse said, communities? So both those questions will start off with you, Jesse. First, placemaking, the different role that you play than a traditional broker, and then the idea of what are the kernels you'd take away for people who are in the business of retail or restaurants, and what do you see as being things that they should look at in the future, particularly going back to what Nia said, these concepts oftentimes, and Jeff mentioned, last for a short time. Okay.
Yeah, I'll start with the last question first. I think one of the major takeaways for all of us thinking about master planning, mixed use development, retail development, is recognizing that despite the fact that we're so connected right now, that trends and realities are so localized when you think about retail, right? So, we've got a bunch of clients and partners who are active across the country, across the globe. What we are experiencing in Greater Boston relative to what Houston and Miami and Chicago and LA are experiencing is completely different. So, I think what's interesting, and, Jeff, like that Toast report, for example, like if you actually dig into it and you look at like where those sales are exploding, you're seeing the nuance of housing prices within that. You're seeing the nuance of politics within that. So I think all of these large macro issues are things that we, as folks who care about retail development and restaurants and building sustainable communities, really have to be thinking about. And the most interesting data point that we've been seeing is where retail real estate pricing is going up. And in some ways, the most downward pressure are in areas that have the highest housing costs, with the exception of some of the places in the Southeast like Miami. And that if you think about it from a tenant perspective, your ability to pay rent and occupancy costs is directly linked, no matter what kind of retailer or restaurateur you are, is directly linked to your overall revenue and P&L. And if you have to pay that much more for labor or cost of goods, you can pay that much less for occupancy costs. It's all linked. So I think that linkage and that holistic view is something that we're really focused on right now. And that'll be my one major takeaway for everyone is like, we're all connected, but it's really different from market to market. And then in terms of, what we're focused on and the idea of kind of building equitable, sustainable, viable places, we've always, as you said, Eric, been hyper focused on localism, building communities based on the strength of small local owner operated businesses, and recognizing the dollars you spend in those places go back into those communities. They're typically more responsible hiring. From an impact perspective, it's hard to even make the case against a regional national versus a best in class local. But where we've failed at Graffito is actually applying an anti-racism lens to our work. And I think moving forward, what we are really focused on, because it's good business, because it's going to make people a lot of money across the board, is how do we put more Black and brown entrepreneurs in business and make the retail community and the restaurant community more reflective of the makeup of the larger community in Greater Boston, and create more opportunities from historically marginalized entrepreneurs. I mean, that's where we are going. And frankly, there are a lot of reasons we're going there. Part of it is just to make up for the fact that we've done a really poor job at Graffito in this in the past. But the other part of it is this is where we see consumers going. This is how we believe landlords are going to make money. And ultimately, if you look at real estate development on a neighborhood scale versus just your little storefront, this is what makes a ton of sense. So that's kind of the way we're looking at neighborhood and community building right now at Graffito. It is a shift, an acknowledged shift, but that's not going to change for perpetuity for our business, and we're super jazzed about it.
Interesting. Nia, and then Jeff will come to you as well. But Nia, how do you look at the future from an operator? You opened up the underground at Northeastern during the pandemic, and as well, your sales has started to pick up. Things are looking up in relation to Darryl's Corner, and I must say that Darryl's Corner and Bar, as you mentioned, when you were a sorority sister, you brought up the others to the place, and you said this would be a place I'd like to own one day, something like this. And it's iconic. It's somewhat different than other restaurants that have a short concept time. They change. Those iconic restaurants are unique. But what do you see as the future? Are you optimistic? And what are the kernels you would say from being a survivor of the pandemic, both personally and professionally, as to what are the kernels of lessons that you've learned going forward?
Yeah, I'll say, and I'll kind of second Jesse's note earlier on that, the truth is that although things are getting better, we're just not at our best yet. We still definitely have more work to do on the business side. When I think about operations, I can say that one of the things that I learned first was that we got a little bit comfortable. So while we do have an iconic place that has a really great formula, we got really dependent on that formula. Prior to the pandemic, we only did 1% of takeout. We had Uber Eats, we had Grubhub, we even had the online ordering in play, but we didn't really utilize it as well as we should. In the middle of the pandemic at its height, it was 100% of our our income, obviously. And now it provides at least 25%, which is truly a significant impact on our overall sales. And so that piece to me was, never get too comfortable. Another note about us starting the underground in the middle of the pandemic is, take that risk. A lot of us are really afraid. I was afraid to talk to, a representative like Graffito at one point in time. In fact, I drove by the underground for about 7 months, wondering about that empty vacant space. And it was on month 7 that I finally reached out. And on month 8, we got shut down from a pandemic, right? So to me, never knowing about that initial conversation and how it would turn several months later, I was actually then approached by the developer. And to me, this is where we're going, right? And the piece of where we're going is this: landlords and their representatives are in fact more open-minded about what makes a good tenant. And you never realize that until, again, you say yes and say, I'm going to take that opportunity to at least present myself. I will say now, in the past 12 months, I was able to present myself to the landlords over at ACC and Northeastern. I did so with 2 other retailers as well. One, in fact, gave me that historic, I'll say reaction, which is what we expect. And when I say we, I'm talking about, a Black woman or just a Black owner, that in times we expect that a realtor or a landlord is going to turn us down because of prior or lack of history of credit or ownership. And then, I got another response from a different one who was like, I can't wait and I'm going to work with you. And so to me, it's about, again, let's not get comfortable. Don't be afraid to take those risks. Don't care about the no that you get, because it definitely will be followed up by a yes. And it might all sound hokey, but I feel like that is, some of the things that I've taken from it that has given me new energy, as well as that kind of fearlessness and empowerment to go to the underground and then talk about future projects.
And Jeff, from your perspective, let's see your thoughts about how your business is going, what you see the future of retail and restaurants, and what kernels you may provide of knowledge and wisdom to those watching.
We'll stop right before knowledge and wisdom, and I'll tell you where I see it going. I wish I knew. So I think in the restaurant space, we're going to continue to see that evolve with consumers wanting both great takeout and options, as well as a great dining experience. I mean, Sunday night was with the family, said, let's get something to eat. And then there was the debate, well, you want to stay home and watch Netflix? Do you want to go out? I said, I'm sick of staying home and watching Netflix. Let's go out, because I think this human need to want to go out and be social animals, okay? So I think that's going to continue. And I think how that translates into the built environment is landlords recognizing that we're not going to be able to squeeze every dollar out of a tenant to activate our first floors or our shopping centers. On the more traditional side of retail, the non-food side, whether it's fitness, whether it's hard, soft goods, however we're classifying that, I still think there's a lot of that retail that's under siege. I think that that new class of retail that's emerging, that's affecting what I call the shopper journey and the shopper environment is to be determined. And some of the more macro issues that Jesse talked about we're going to start, I think, seeing some of that reflected in the tendencies of these buildings that we're working on, no matter who we're representing. What for me is going to be sort of the most difficult piece of this is how do we, as good advocates for whoever we're working for, put them in the right place and set them up for some long-term future success. And it's always going to be the levers that you push and pull as we go through these negotiations and as we set the table to make these neighborhoods and these shopping centers effective and attractive places for consumers to still want to come to. And that is going to be the challenge going forward. Knowledge and wisdom is just maybe recognizing that that's the challenge and trying to best advocate to bring about what we saw in during the pandemic, which is great collaborations between landlords and tenants.
And just to sum up some thoughts that I have regarding it is that, Jeff, you touched on the point that we're social beings. And there's a recent article that I sent to Jesse that was trying to analyze, our city's going to come back, what's going on. And it said cities do not really attract people because of the museums. It attracts them because of, that neighborhood feel, that we're together, the idea of going to a museum with friends, of going out to dinner with friends, of meeting new people. We get together for those reasons. And that is the pent-up frustration. The other thing I'd point out is that, as Jesse and I have frequently talked, landlords are increasingly, if they're smart, seeing the first floor as an amenity and as part of the community. And Danny Meyer, in setting the table, talked about that in relation to his first Shake Shack, which was in Madison Park, which was a needle park. And when it started to flourish, Danny said, these are the groups I look at. I look at my employees. I look at the community. I look at the product that I'm providing. And I look at those things. And if I raise those, my investors are going to be happy. But what's significant is that changed from a needle park into a family park. And all the buildings around Madison Park became more valuable. So as Jesse looks at that placemaking setting, what he's looking at is making the community thrive and the various factors he talks about. And Nia, you and I talked about the fact that when you did the coalition, you had more power together, even though they were competitors. If we all do well, it's best for each of us individually, so that you weren't atoms anymore. You had more buying power. You had the ability to help each other in a variety of ways that you didn't know before. That makes you stronger and makes the community stronger. So I believe that we're going to come back. I do believe the challenges that Jesse mentioned, particularly the housing challenge, which is scary, which can break up communities if we don't keep an eye on it. We're 6 million housing units short. Rents are going through the roof and prices for homes. So, but nonetheless, I am optimistic for that reason that Jeff touched on. We're social beings. We want to get out. We want to be with people, and we like to be together. We have about 6 minutes left. Jeanette, are there any questions that come?
I don't have any in right now. If anybody has a question, you can either use the Q&A function or the chat function. But also mindful of time, we are coming right up to 10 a.m. We covered a number of topics. If any of the participants have questions after the fact, Jeff, Nia, Jesse, are you comfortable with people directly reaching out to you?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so after this, after we conclude this webinar, we'll send around a copy of the Zoom recording along with everybody's contact information. Oh, and we do have one comment, question from Heather Hampton. Where can we find that article you just referenced?
Oh, the article on society, I'd be happy to make it available for anybody who contacts me. I send it on to Jesse, I remember, and I'll send it on to others if they'd like it. So just get in touch.
Great. Thank you again to our panelists for joining us. And Eric, if you have any other final comments, we will.
I only have to say that a cautionary tale to landlords legally is the Cafe Nero case that came out. And that was about Newberry Street. And what it basically did was support exactly what you're talking about. One of the most respected judges in the state, Judge Salinger, came out, and Jeff had spoken about force majeure, and went beyond the force majeure clause and to common law, and basically a landlord in this situation, Cafe Nero on Newberry Street, had shut down because the pandemic, came back in a variety of ways to try to work it out, and put $1.3 million into the premises on a long-term lease. Landlord did not negotiate, accelerated rents, sued, and Judge Salinger came out in favor of Cafe Nero, who had worked out, interestingly, 29 of 30 forbearance agreements with other landlords. I had done one of those with Cafe Nero, as a matter of fact. But what the tale is that we need to work together, as Jeff, Nia, Jesse have emphasized. This is not, in this brave new world we're in, and it is different than anything we saw. We're not putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. It's a new world. And as Nia said, you have to take challenges on. But Judge Salinger is saying in his decision, that was largely decided on a frustration, clearly decided on a common law principle of frustration of purpose. You couldn't have a dining in restaurant if the governor told you couldn't. So you had to go to takeout, and we should work together. And I think that's a general theme that runs through this, is we should work together. Everything works better together. And I think that everybody has mentioned that. So thank you all for attending. Jesse and Nia and Jeff, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your incredibly busy lives to join us today. And Nia, I'm glad you didn't have an emergency today in the restaurant, which is the nature of the business. Yes.
One final comment. If you're going to visit Darryl's Corner Bar and Kitchen, Nia, you recommend the shrimp and grits.
Absolutely.
Correct.
Absolutely.
All right. Good to know. All right. Thank you all. And thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.